As violent as all that was, it was made out to be even more violent in the media as an excuse to paint the people, the Cherokees out in Oklahoma and Appalachians, as being backward, violent, and uncivilized. And so they were able to come in and take their resources. I sort of ramble. Sometimes I get a little stream of consciousness and wander around, but for the most part, we have kind of an ongoing discussion, which I enjoy being a part of. Sometimes, well, if we go past 8 o'clock, I'll stay for a few minutes for anyone that wants to ask further questions, but we'll officially be ended. Hello, Mike. Well, just a little bit quickly about what Nassau is. I guess I'll give it a try. Let's see how well I do it, and you can fill in the gaps I might leave. But it's I think that in my message to you, Valerie, I had said that I kind of compared it to the earlier Highlander folk institute. You know, a desire to sort of like help the community, a desire to train organizers. And particularly, I think particularly with High's background with the Rainbow Coalition days, the idea of doing that in kind of a cross-sectional way with different groups that might not ordinarily come into contact with one another or be expected to be on the same page, which I think is a very important thing. Now, I personally, my background is that even though I'm a college professor now, I didn't start college till I was 32. I was actually the first male in the entire history of my family to graduate high school. I'm from rural Appalachia. And so the idea of that sort of cross-cultural, cross-national, cross-class cooperation really appeals to me. What should I have said that I didn't? Anybody?
I think that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, other than we're a nonprofit as of last year.
Well, since we have a couple of new people, I will just real quickly tell you, kind of summarize where we were as of the end of last week. So this is a 6-part series about the legacy of Red Power, but we're really not going to get into the birth of that movement in the 60s, probably until next time. I spent last time giving some background and context, which is the bane of anyone who has to deal with a historian. When my family, when they hear me say the word context, they just tune out. But basically the context of what the legal situation was by the 1960s and how it got to be that way. And so I know that our guests are well familiar with a lot of this stuff. We talked about the end of the treaty era in 1871. We talked about the Crow Dog case and how that led to the Major Crimes Act that led to Congress interceding within the borders of Native nations on the reservations or elsewhere, and how that really kind of set the stage for the Dawes Act and allotment. Because once the government said certain groups of people who had been deemed wards of the state and domestic dependent nations, we talked about that too, if they're not capable of making important decisions about things like murder, then it was just a short step from there to saying, well, since they're wards of the state, are they really capable of anything, or should we just make all their decisions for them? Which is kind of what allotment was, and a move to Americanize Native people by basically changing how they looked at property, as well as trying to suppress their culture. And we talked about, the advent of the boarding schools and the Carlisle Indian School and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of where we left off. And a couple of people were already ticked off at the U.S. government by the time that we ended. So tonight, I'm going to kind of go forward from there, and I'm going to talk about the beginnings, sort of the presaging of indigenous activism in the way that we think of it in modern terms. So I have this time, by golly, I got a slide presentation and everything, man. So I'm gonna see if I can share this with you. Pick which one I'm sharing. So voila. Can you see it? I think you can.
We can see it.
All right, these are the La Flèche siblings. Anybody familiar with them? They were Ponca from Nebraska, and they also had kinship ties to the Omaha of Nebraska. Their father was the result of a union, of a marriage between a French trapper and a Ponca woman, but the Ponca woman had relatives among the Omaha. And so they had connections with both of those tribes in Nebraska. They were actually half siblings. Suzette was the oldest, and she was the daughter of one of the elder Joseph La Flèche's wives, and these other two folks were from one of the others. Now, Susan La Flèche, the youngest, was the first Native American to graduate medical school in the United States and get an MD. And that was in probably the 1880s. I didn't check for sure on the day. I know before 1890. So late 1870s, early 1880s by that point. So that's pretty significant. The other two, Francis actually became an anthropologist, sociologist. He worked for the Smithsonian Institute as an ethnographer. And Suzette, the oldest of the three, she also went to college, got an education, and she was a journalist. She wrote for a lot of newspapers, and she was heavily involved in advocacy for education. Now, the way that these three come into our story is because of this guy, Standing Bear, who was a leader from the Ponca tribe. Any of you familiar with Standing Bear? Well, let me ask this. Are any of you familiar with the movie that came out about 3 or 4 years ago, the Western Hostiles? Remember that? It had Christian Bale as the prerequisite white hero cavalryman, and Wes Studi, one of my favorite actors. I think he's from the Cherokee Nation. Played a character loosely based on Standing Bear. Any of you see that movie? It turned me off immediately because just reading the descriptions about it, it was about how this cavalryman who hated Native Americans was transporting this elderly chief to his homeland through hostile Comanche territory, and it was supposed to be set in the 1890s. And there had been no fighting with the Comanches in 20 years at that point. So that automatically told me, well, take this with a grain of salt. So it's very loosely based on the story of Standing Bear. What happened is that, yes.
I did want to mention that. I know that Bailey, I think maybe you might have seen it, but we did we set up an article in the group that was talking about Standing Bear, that he is one of the, when the insurrection was happening and they kept panning that Native American statue, that was Standing Bear out of Nebraska, went to the Supreme Court to say that, Indians are people, basically.
Yeah, the irony of showing up in those images. So what had happened is that Standing Bear's people had been removed to Oklahoma, and his son died, and he had promised his son that he would bury him in their homeland in Nebraska. So he and about 30 of his followers, 30 of his people, took his son's body up to Nebraska to bury him, and they were arrested by the U.S. cavalry for leaving the reservation. And the officer in charge was Brigadier General George Crook, who is most famous for being his involvement with Geronimo about a decade after this. So Standing Bear was arrested, as were his followers, for having left. And this is where the LaFleshes come into the story. Standing Bear and his story got the attention of an Omaha newspaper man who started writing about the injustice of what was happening. And this was not too long after Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce or Nez Perce and what had happened there. And Chief Joseph and his people had gotten a lot of public sympathy because of the perceived, injustice of what had happened to them. Now, this kind of ties into something that I said last time, and that in fact, my dissertation was sort of centered around the idea that how Americans in general, meaning white people, how they view Native people is contingent on proximity in space and time. In other words, once they are successfully removed to another place and to the past, then they can be romanticized. But while they are still there and are therefore competitors for the resources, they are just viewed in a very demonized way. And I'd read last time some of the famous quotes from the statement by L. Frank Baum, if you guys are familiar, the guy that wrote The Wizard of Oz. He just wrote terrible things around the time of Wounded Knee about how they all need to be, right? So I believe that you started seeing people like Chief Joseph and Standing Bear getting public sympathy right around the time the Indian Wars in the West, except with the Apaches who held out longer, were ending. So all of a sudden it was safer for folks to espouse or to sort of magnanimously say, look at these noble people and how they're being mistreated. But I could go on and on about that. I guess we should stick with what actually happened. What happened was that Crook was actually sympathetic to Standing Bear. And I think that it was Crook's suggestion that, you should sue me. Certainly it was the newspaper man's idea. And the newspaper guy, Tom Tyndall, I think his name was, he wound up over the course of all this meeting and falling in love with Suzette LaFleche, and they got married. So with the help of like pro bono lawyers, Standing Bear sued General Crook. The case was called Standing Bear versus Crook, in which the argument was that Standing Bear was unlawfully detained. They did not have habeas corpus. And as Valerie pointed out, by the time this went to the Supreme Court, the important thing about this is that the court ruled, for the very first time the court ever said anything like this, for the very first time the US government ever said anything like this, Indians are people, are human beings, and therefore have natural rights, such as the right to habeas corpus, the right to not be illegally detained. So Standing Bear won that case, and actually, I think he and his band got to go back to Nebraska. But as a result of this, after the case was over, Standing Bear traveled around the country with Suzette and Francis LaFlèche accompanying him as his interpreters, and not just interpreting his speeches as he gave them, but also writing editorials, arguing in favor of recognizing the humanity of Native peoples. And so all three of them made a big impression on the public, and all three of them, as a result, I think, could be termed activists in the way that we think of the term today. Now, Suzette LaFlèche and her new husband, they wound up at Wounded Knee. I think they arrived there right after the 1890 massacre, but they were there as witnesses to what had happened. Susan LaFlèche served, I think, for a while as the one of the doctors there. No, I'm confusing her with Charles Eastman. So let's talk about Charles Eastman. Charles Eastman, who was Dakota. I'm gonna do my best on these names because we have someone here who can correct me, and I like to learn. Ohiyesa? Is that Valerie? Is that good? Anyway, let's talk about Carlos Montezuma first, though. Carlos Montezuma was Yavapai, who sometimes were referred to as Apaches, even though they're not Apache, by the settlers, the white settlers in the area. His name was Wasaja. He was captured. Excuse me, I'm getting distracted by my two kittens that are now destroying my desk. He was captured as a child by Pima tribal members, who then sold him into slavery. And this would have been in the 1870s. I think he was born in 1866. And he was bought by an Italian guy, an Italian photographer, who had come to the US and was in the American West taking photographs of Native people. So he paid, I think, $30 for him, and adopted him and renamed him. He named him Carlos Montezuma, Montezuma in reference to the native heritage of his. And he grew up traveling around with his Italian adopted photographer father. And they were in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for a while. And then he became the second Native American to graduate from medical school. He went to high school. He graduated high school at Urbana High School, which is cool because that's where I used to live when I went to the University of Illinois, and my daughter and granddaughter still live there. And he graduated from the University of Illinois, and then he went to Chicago for medical school, and he became the doctor at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And I talked a little bit about that school last time. one of the all-time greatest college football teams, was fielded by the Carlisle Indian School. Of course, the Carlisle Indians, with Jim Thorpe eventually as their star player in the 1900s. And Pop Warner was their coach. He's who the Little League football is named after. And Montezuma was the team doctor, and he traveled with the team. Charles Eastman, another Native American who went to medical school. I think he may have been the third. Someone else may have come before him. He wound up being a doctor at the Pine Ridge Agency and was present at Wounded Knee. Later on, about 20 years after that, these two guys were the two probably most well-known of several people who came together and formed an organization called Society of American Indians. And that is significant because it is the first such advocacy society for Native rights to be founded by and composed of actual Native people. And they were very active in trying to get policy changed. The organization kind of died out in about a decade after it was formed, but it was an important forerunner for a lot of similar organizations that came afterward. Now, while this organization was getting underway, of course, World War I started in 1914. The US got involved in 1917. And beginning with World War I, every American military conflict since World War I, Native people have been proportionally to the population the highest percentage of people to volunteer for military service in wartime. So large numbers of indigenous men and women joined the military during World War I, and many others were actively involved in raising funds and various other means of support. Now, the significant thing about indigenous people's service in World War I is they were not segregated. You know, the African Americans were segregated. World War II, Japanese Americans would also be segregated, but Native Americans were not. And what that means is that in just about any military unit, there's a good chance there'd be at least one American Indian in the unit. And that enabled the non-Native people to, for one thing, see that they were not extinct and they were real people. And that went a long way toward advocacy for tribal rights, as it turns out. Kind of on the downside, proportionally, according to racial or ethnic group, Native Americans in World War I had the highest casualty rate. And one possible explanation for that is that commanders either thought they were more expendable or perhaps more likely subscribed to romanticized stereotypes and thought, oh, there's a minefield. Who has almost magical powers to navigate through the wilderness? We've got some Indians. Let's send them out there. And they got killed in really large numbers. But after the war was over, there was a lot of press about the service of Native people. As a result, the year after the war ended in 1919, there was the Congressional Act granting American citizenship, US citizenship, to American Indians who had served in the military during the war. On the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, how messed up is that? You know, that these actual Americans, if you will, had to be granted citizenship that late. And even then, only the ones who served in the military. However, again, in part because of World War I. By 1924, there was pressure on Congress to do more And 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. And that's when Native American people became American citizens. Now, if you're familiar with the 14th Amendment right after the Civil War, the one that says anyone born within the borders of the United States is a citizen. And the reason that was done at that time was to, basically demonstrate that freed slaves were citizens. That did not apply to Native people because they were already considered by the US government at that time to be citizens of separate, although dependent, nations. So 1924 is when you actually get US citizenship. Now in the 20s, the Dawes Act was still in force, still in effect. I mentioned last time the situation with the University of Illinois mascot, Chief Olinowek, which first started being used in the mid-1920s. And they actually used ceremonial Lakota regalia that had been donated to them by a Native American leader to put on their mascot. And if you were on a reservation and a member of that tribe or any other tribe at that time, and you were caught wearing clothes like that, you'd be arrested because you were not allowed to practice your culture. Well, this brings us to this guy who's going to be, I think a good way to describe it is he's going to bring things maybe 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There's going to be a definite shift that's going to benefit Native people. And John Collier was a big part of it. He was a sociologist who learned about the living conditions on the reservations in the early 1920s and started advocating for Native American rights to practice their culture and to have their land. And he started an organization that was not the Society of American Indians. It was not made up of Native people. But because of his pushing, Congress authorized a report, an investigation on the reservations to see how well the Dawes Act was working. Because it was supposed to, the whole point was to improve Native people's lives, right? And so this report was finished and brought to President Hoover in 1928, 29. It's called the Merriam Report. And what they discovered was Native people are much worse off than they were in 1887 or 1890 when allotments started being applied. Health was bad. There was a lot of issues with poverty and various other things. And it was just, it hadn't worked at all. It had had the opposite of its intended effect. If you take at face value what its intended effect was. When Hoover was defeated in 1932 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Roosevelt made John Collier the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And this led to what's known as the Indian Reorganization Act, not long after Roosevelt took office, which is also known as the Indian New Deal. So, you know, Roosevelt had all these New Deal policies that he had promised in his campaign that had helped get him elected. The New Deal was going to apply to Native peoples. And so a lot of the stuff from the Dawes Act was reversed. The Dawes Act had discorporated tribal governments. Tribal governments were allowed, tribes were allowed to have tribal governments again. But remember, I said it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Collier was the champion for these things, but he was also extremely condescending and arrogant and prone to deciding for himself what was culturally best for Native people. So a lot of indigenous folks were not as supportive of him as they might have been otherwise. one of the things that this is one of the ways this is demonstrated is tribes were allowed to have tribal governments again, but they weren't allowed to select their own government, their own chiefs, their own leaders. It was chosen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and John Collier. So it's definitely better than allotment. It's a step in the right direction, but it was at the same time still kind of a slap in the face in some ways. But many of the restrictions against Native culture, and in particular the Native religion, were reversed, but not all of them. That wouldn't come until the 1970s, and we'll definitely be talking about that later on. So the last 130 or 40 years, if you look at relations between the federal government and indigenous tribes, it's been kind of like a pendulum. You know, you had the Dawes Act that swung way over here. You know, like we are just going to, well, the expression was kill the Indian to save the man. We're not going to kill you personally anymore, but we're going to kill the Indian out of you. So all the way over here, then the Indian New Deal, things swing back this way a little bit, but you know, not nearly as far as they should have. So that's where things were in the Roosevelt administration. And then World War II came along, and World War II was, I argue that World War I and World War II were two of the most important, not the most important, but two, and maybe the top 10 things in American Indian history in the 20th century. For the same reasons as World War I, but more so, because a lot more Native people joined up this time around. And not only did they interact with non-Native people, but because there were so many of them, this time around, any given unit might have 2 Native people, and they might be from different nations, from different parts of the country, people that might never have met one another if not for this, but they did meet and started comparing notes and realizing that a lot of their problems were the same problems. And the Pan-Indian movement that Carlos Montezuma and Eastman and others were trying to get going in the early 20th century, and which Tecumseh had been trying to get going in the early 19th century, really started to take hold because networks were built in the military by Native men and Native women who were serving not only as nurses, but like women's auxiliary corps and officers and so forth. And they stayed in touch. In fact, Ira Hayes, I bet most of you are familiar with Ira Hayes. Speaking of Pima people, he was one of the Marines who planted the flag in that famous photograph on Mount Suribachi. He actually traveled around right after the war and spoke. In fact, we're going to be talking about the National Congress of American Indians in a moment. There was a movie a few years ago. I talk about movies a lot because I'm kind of a pop culture guy, called Flags of Our Fathers, directed by Clint Eastwood. Did anybody see that one? I recommend that you watch that and Letters from Iwo Jima, both directed by Clint Eastwood. They filmed them back to back, and they essentially told the same story, first from the American side, then from the Japanese side. And the Japanese one was actually, I think, a lot better. But Adam Beach, the actor Adam Beach, played Ira Hayes in that film, did a wonderful job. It even showed in a montage of what he was doing after the war. It showed him speaking at a conference of the NCAI. So World War II, you've got political activism starting to happen as more and more Native people are making connections around the country. And also, it's around this time that the powwow culture, as we now know it, started to develop, because once the Roosevelt administration lifted some of those prescriptions against practicing traditional native culture, then you were able to do things like that. And people had started to meet one another because of the war. So things are definitely going in a better direction at this point. And it was during the war in 1944 that the National Congress of American Indians was established, which is still around today. Initially a handful, representatives from a handful of tribes, a whole lot now, and still active in advocacy and in trying to get things changed. Before I talk about the Delorias, though, because Vine Deloria became the director of this organization in the 60s, I want to talk about what else happened after World War II. 1946, Roosevelt, of course, had died in early 45, elected to president 4 consecutive times. And the Democrats had been in control of the White House and Congress ever since Hoover was kicked out. So that's a pretty long stretch. Americans have, I think, short memories. And again, that's a long stretch for one party to be in charge. The fact that there was a depression and a world war going on had a lot to do with that. But once the war was over and the depression was over and Roosevelt wasn't president because he died and Truman took over, there was a strong shift toward conservatism in the United States. And the midterm elections in 1946, Republicans swept those all over the country and got a supermajority, in fact, after being pretty much out of power for about 14 years. So that's going to totally shift the direction things are going. And a lot of those conservative Republicans wanted to undo a lot of the stuff Roosevelt had done. And the Indian New Deal was one of them. Another thing that came about because of this was the law that weakened unions so much, practically crippled unions compared to how they were before. But also the federal government's actions with Native peoples, which, according to the Constitution, we covered this last time, U.S. Congress is actually the part of the federal government, that not just the legislative branch, Congress specifically, that is empowered to treat with and trade with American Indians. And there was this movement called Termination. And that sounds very foreboding. It's not an Arnold Schwarzenegger type termination, although in a previous century it might well have been. It's not like going out and terminating the lives of Native people by killing them. It was terminating the special relationship, that's how Congress put it, the special relationship between tribal governments and the federal government, that all those treaties and stuff were preventing Indians from assimilating and becoming fully American, right? Because they had all these stipulations, all these obligations the federal government had subjected itself to with the treaties and so forth. So the way it was framed was, we're going to help Native people, Native American people. We're going to help them by setting them on their own feet. This essentially would have led to every tribe that this process was enacted upon then lost federal recognition as a tribe, which means that really legally, according to the US, their tribal governments were essentially nil. And the encouragement instead was for individual American Indians to leave the reservation, leave their traditional lands, and move to the cities and get jobs so they can more easily pursue the American dream, more easily become more Americanized, which becoming Americanized means becoming more capitalist. essentially with both the Dawes Act and with termination. Now, the Dawes Act, back in the late 80s and into the 90s, it wasn't done overnight all at once with everybody. It was kind of a process. Same thing with termination. Not all tribes were terminated for a couple of different reasons. One was that tribes were getting more support in the 1940s and 50s from the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court was, at that time, the only one of the three branches coming anywhere close to any kind of equitable dealing. So there were a lot of cases recognizing tribal rights, but also a lot of the larger tribes, especially, did not agree to the government's terms of signing these papers, and were trying to, legally oppose those things. And it kind of dragged out. The government lost interest. By the early 60s, new administration had come in. Kennedy didn't get real involved, but LBJ did toward changing that policy. And believe it or not, Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon really did a lot of things to restore power to tribal governments, which this is why, if you look at the history of various native nations, you'll see that their constitutions that they currently operate under were written in the early 70s. And that's because a lot of those tribal governments, they were discorporated in the Dawes Act, allowed back on kind of a tenuous basis, and then only in the 1970s allowed to have any degree of sovereignty in as much as, maybe I shouldn't say be allowed. Sovereignty is something you inherently have. You're not granted it. But recognition to be able to administer their own affairs. So there's that pendulum. Okay, you've got the Dawes Act that takes a lot of stuff away. You've got the Indian New Deal that gives some stuff back. And then you've got termination that comes back this way. And then in the 1970s, things start to kind of come back. And it's kind of in a tenuous place right now. It's hard to describe the last 4 years, particularly. But yeah, just kind of back and forth. There's a guy named Robert A. Williams, who is a legal scholar, and he's a member of the Lumbee tribe. And he's also, at least the last time I spoke with him, was serving as a judge on the Pima Reservation, I think. Very much a national activist for American Indian rights. But he wrote a book called Like a Loaded Weapon. Actually, his book called The American Indian and Western Legal Thought is just magnificent. And I wish I could assign it in classes, but it's out of print. The other one's still in print. But essentially, the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled in the past that Congress has basically unlimited power where native tribes go. That's why this pendulum has gone back and forth, right? They'll do it when they want to do it. And the only thing that keeps them from doing it is if the voting public is aware of it and has its sympathies aroused by native activists. So that's kind of a hint as to where we're going to be going when we talk about the Red Power movement and the American Indian movement and others. But essentially, that ruling is what he's talking about when he said it's like a loaded weapon. That essentially, it's just like a loaded weapon pointed at Native Americans' heads, tribal governments' heads, that could just go off anytime. And there's nothing inherent in the Constitution or in precedents in the courts to stop that if it were to happen. And we talked, for those of you who weren't here, we talked last time about how all federal Indian law right now goes back to essentially the Marshall decisions back in the 1820s and 1830s. And the Marshall decisions, the Supreme Court under John Marshall, used as their precedent English common law and Spanish law, that is, the laws of the colonial powers. And the Spanish used as their precedent a papal canon about the Crusades, allowing crusaders to take the land away from infidels. So our entire legal system where American Indians are concerned today, trace it back, is based on the Crusades. So that's a very tenuous position, and the back and forth is never anything that can be reassuring because it can change. Now, I would argue, and I will argue, that the Red Power movement was extraordinarily effective. In the mid-70s, they stopped occupying things because they no longer had to. They had essentially achieved their purpose, and their purpose was to get people's attention. And they got people's attention. And then, all these laws started changing in the mid and late 1970s. Once the public's attention is distracted, is when things become dangerous, like at Standing Rock, the situation with Standing Rock that I'm assuming most of you are familiar with, to 2016 into 2017, when the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation for that pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was rerouted to go right along their water source there on the edge of the reservation and through land, actually, that by treaty, they were supposed to have access to themselves instead. That was rerouted from Bismarck. It was supposed to go right by Bismarck, but the people in Bismarck thought it might be dangerous. So they rerouted it. But there wasn't a lot in the news about that while it was happening until it was almost over. And I noticed that a lot of the coverage in December 2016 framed things such that these protesters, most of whom are Native American, have provoked the police. And then the police responded with violence. But it's putting the blame on the Native people. And that's, again, particularly newspapers in North Dakota, because you've got resources, again, at stake. So anyway, I don't want to get ahead of myself and do the whole final lecture in the middle of the second one. So I will talk a little bit about Vine Deloria. Vine Deloria was, I think, Yankton, Dakota by birth, but his father, I believe, had been a clergyman and was living actually at Standing Rock. And so the family's tribal membership got shifted to Standing Rock. But Deloria was a Native American intellectual and both a brilliant and a hilarious person. I have a picture of his sister here because she should be mentioned as well. His sister, Ella, who became an anthropologist and a novelist. Deloria, while he was in charge of the NCAI, there was this incident, 1966, where Congress, this congressional committee had this closed meeting to restructure the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And no Indians were invited to the meeting. And not only were they not invited, they were not allowed in. And so large numbers of them crowded the hallways in protest. Deloria is most famous for this book, which came up actually in conversation last time. One of our people in attendance had said it had been recommended to them. Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian manifesto. This, if you haven't read this book, you should read it twice. It's a very good book. He makes a lot of very good arguments, and he's very very witty, bitingly so, in the way that he does it. This was part of what has come to be known as the Native American Renaissance in literature in the late 1960s, early 70s. It was around the same time that House Maid of Dawn by Scott Momaday won the Pulitzer Prize, Momaday being Kiowa, I think. Anyway, the NCAI, very active throughout all this termination period. However, by the early 1960s, some younger Native peoples were getting frustrated with the slow progress, if any progress at all, and they were getting frustrated with what they viewed as too conciliatory an approach by the people in charge of the tribal governments and even of the NCAI. There was a meeting in Chicago, 1961, there's a big, several organizations were there, but these three young men in the upper right, Bruce Wilkie, Clyde Warrior, and Mel, I'm not sure if his last name is pronounced Thom, but anyhow, they and others co-founded a new organization, the National Indian Youth Council, Incorporated, which is also still around. It was mostly college students or young people who had just graduated college age. And it's very similar to me to what was going on in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that started in 1960-61 as being very much a civil rights era, peaceful protest type of thing. But Stokely Carmichael, who became the leader of SNCC and was one of the co-founders, by the mid-60s was very frustrated with that approach and was calling for direct action. That's what the National Indian Youth Council was doing, calling for direct action. Here you see some marching, I think this is in 1970. Indians are red, BIA, what are you? This is a black and white picture, but you can probably guess that the BIA side is yellow. I wanted to mention these two folks at the bottom, Faith Smith and Robert Dumont, because they tie in to the history of the Rainbow Coalition. They were workers at the American Indian Center in Chicago, which several of the Native groups that I and the Young Patriots and Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers were working with were connected with that center, and Faith Smith in particular was very outspoken. And then they formed a more outspoken, I guess you could say, apart from within the American Indian Center, the Native American Committee. And another thing to talk about direct action that the National Indian Youth Council started doing in the early 60s was fish-ins. Wilkie, I believe it was Wilkie, was from his people are from the Pacific Northwest, but there were a lot of issues. There continue to be issues with fishing rights, particularly the state of Washington. The state of Washington has just been a great big jerk for 100 years toward Native people and their fishing rights. So very, very visible actions of going in and occupying these areas, these fisheries. And they got some added notoriety and attention when a celebrity, Marlon Brando, came in there and was doing this stuff with them, and some other folks did too that believed in their cause. But this was not kind of the diplomatic, let's go through channels way of doing things. And it was a forerunner. They eventually became a part of the Red Power movement. But they were sort of like pointing forward to it a few years before it actually happened. So now I've set the stage for the events of the late 1960s. And so hopefully you'll have a clearer idea of what folks were facing at that time and how it was laid out and how it worked. So I've gone right up to my hour limit, unfortunately. But I will, so don't feel bad if you have to go. But any questions are welcomed, questions and conversation.
Troy, so
Yes.
wanted to back up to that conversation about the beginning of the Red Power movement, as well as the beginning of a lot of the Native Americans who joined the service, which is which
Yeah.
we had to research that because we were a part of the city of Montgomery's celebration of the 65th event for the bus boycott. And in that, they asked us, what were Native Americans doing at that time? And I had to explain to them that, because of all those policies, termination, relocation, and assimilation, that within all that, we were dealing with 95% decimation of population. So whereas we could have stood with them, shoulder to shoulder, we obviously could not, because we were still recovering from those policies.
Yeah.
And so with that, it was in the second part of the assimilation, not the residential school portion, but the portion that created the vocational training programs all across the United States, which was hand in hand trying to have these families move, my own family included, across the different states. And so my mother tells me that, they moved from South Dakota to Cincinnati. And in that, they were living a suburban life. They had TV, they had radios, they had schools, they had all this stuff. And they started having their own groups to come together. And so she said that was the beginning of the Red Power movement, because they had access to radios, because they had electricity, because they had access to TVs, they started to watch all of the things that were happening to Black people. And then they started being able to group together and form these different coalitions wherever they were. Because my grandfather, he set up his own coalition in Cincinnati, which is so weird because I'm doing one in Alabama, but he brought everybody together from all the different tribes that had made that move. And so with that part of assimilation, those kids went on, they got an education, they went on to college, and they started figuring out all the discrepancies and how to fight it. And so, that was my portion of where the Red Power movement comes from.
Well, that's why I'm so glad that you were able to be here. That also explains why Minneapolis is going to play such a large role.
Right.
A lot of stuff that happens because so many of the urbanized Indians wound up in there. I mean, lots of, all major cities really.
And you mentioned the Constitution, and the Constitution is actually based from the Iroquois and the Great Law of Peace. And with that, in that Constitution, the treaties are the supreme law of the land. But also within that Constitution, it calls us merciless Indian savages.
Yes.
So it's twofold. It's twofold where the government has to try to say that we are dependent on them, when it was in actuality, the policies that they enacted of genocide and actively hunting people for scalps and actively killing off the food population and actively stopping all of those things and diseases and smallpox, all of that made way for this whole thing of trying to push down what we're really about. But because we're all sovereign nations, we have nation to nation agreements. The Navajo Nation has put an embassy up this week in Washington.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's good.
So nobody understands that. And they always try to say that we're dependent, but we're dependent because in taking all of the land, you have to honor the treaty.
Yeah, because
honor the treaty means that you will provide what they said for as long as the grass grows and the sun shines.
So in entering into those treaties, those tribal governments were giving up a large part of their livelihood.
Yes.
By giving up their hunting rights, the land that they depended upon. So therefore, they have to live. So that's, people have this perception of Indians are always looking for a handout from the government. It's not a handout. It's what's owed. But the thing, yeah.
I'm a writer for powwows.com, and so I've been able to talk about this conversation about the Native American tribes and stuff. So if y'all ever have a chance, y'all could go ahead and check it out. And it's just my form of advocacy, and putting myself into the conversation of where I come from. But like you see, Valerie's from the North, and being a Native American from the South is totally different, because like she was saying about the boycott movement, it's like we're trying, like it's like we were conservative because we've been suppressed for so long, and we had so much in most cases, like for me, the Blacks were treated better than what we were. And in South Louisiana, like my grandmothers had to go to a Methodist school because the Methodist church actually gave them education before the parish or county would give them an education, So they had funded white schools and they funded Black schools, but they didn't want to fund Indian schools. So it's like, that's the kind of motion we in, and that's why, like right now, especially in this day and time, so many of our people are still so conservative, and they go with what the white people say still, because I guess they was just in this mindset of, like I said, being suppressed for so long, and had to, in most cases, like for census reasons, we would be labeled as Black or mulatto and not Native, because they try to say like there was no natives in Louisiana. And it's kind of like we're trying to get our people out that mindset. Like, we need to go ahead and do the right thing and stop, continue being suppressed and in this colonized mindset.
Is there a website address that we can go to read your work?
Yeah, you could go to powwows.com.
Powwows, okay.
Mm-hmm.
.com. Thank you.
Yeah, Troy, you mentioned Bob Dumont.
Yeah.
Robert Dumont. Yeah, he worked. He and his sister Nancy and Faith Smith. All, as you said, we're all in Uptown, and we and the Young Patriots worked. We all worked together and organized together. And we were able to get, Bob Dumont has a PhD. He's a very educated fellow, and we managed to get him on staff of Northeastern Illinois University when we opened up the Uptown People Center. And so they taught, they were teaching the Native American history classes at the same time bringing in Native Americans and getting them into school, to get an education. And, but I like what Bailey was saying was, some of the American Indians were treated worse than, the Blacks. And that was also true in Uptown. Now the Blacks were treated pretty badly, worse than, the white population or the Hispanic population, but the American Indian, they were looked up on as just having no worth at all. And that was just, total hell. We were protesting and getting into housing and, of course, making the coalitions with the Black Panthers and, AIM came in, but the Native American Committee, NAC, as we called it, as part of what I guess Bob Dumont and Faith Smith and Nancy Dumont and some others were involved in, really opened up a lot of people's eyes to the conditions of the Native Americans. And we were actually joining together with them and some and AIM and some other organizations, American Indian organizations and tribes, and we took over some land and set up an Indian village, in Chicago, and actually, lived there for a couple of months before they were evicted. But, they were just so full of knowledge in their culture that it was so great of them to be able to share that culture, with us. and that's just a priceless education.
And things like what we're doing right now and the things I hope come from this are in the same vein.
Yeah.
You remember when I said earlier that public sympathy for some Native people like Standing Bear and Chief Joseph came about after a lot of the fighting was over with? Well, there wasn't a lot of public sympathy for Sitting Bull in 1876 after, Custer had his really, really bad day. There was just like a patriotic outcry. But there was one group of white folks that sided with the Lakota and their allies publicly, and that was unions. There's a lot of examples of union leaders and organizers at the time in 1876, 77, writing about how what was being done to Native people was what also gets done to workers, and they have really the same enemy.
I wanted to add also, I think a lot of that sympathy, when I go back and read some of that history, a lot of that sympathy started with the groups that went overseas with the Wild West, Buffalo Bill shows, and then also the continuance of those world fairs where all the tribes were setting up as if they were having their own villages there, and people were paying money to go and see them in that. And then also Geronimo being dragged here and there and everywhere as a showpiece, but he was a prisoner of war till he died,
Yeah.
Wow.
That is interesting how sometimes in some ways, in a backhanded way, different types of oppression can backfire. Just like what you were talking about with termination and Native population being scattered and then concentrated in these urban areas with the radios and so forth. That was an unintended consequence of that government policy. It's not what the government had in mind.
Right.
Have you ever heard the story of what Sitting Bull would do on payday when he worked for Buffalo Bill? So he got paid, the Native performers got paid like everybody else. It was paid in $20 gold pieces, double eagles. They used to, that's why sometimes the old expression, I haven't heard the eagle scream in a month of Sundays, you have that double eagle in your hand. But as he was traveling around with the Wild West show, up and down the East Coast, and they even went across the ocean, but especially on the East Coast in the large cities like Philadelphia and Washington and New York and Baltimore, he saw something that he could not wrap his mind around. And that was that there were people living in exorbitant wealth in those cities, and there were other people who were homeless and starving. And there were children, large numbers of orphaned children living on the streets, homeless and starving, while other people lived in luxury. And of course, in his culture, that would never happen, right? Everyone's doing well together, or everyone's doing bad together. So what he would do when they paid him, he had no use for the money, is he would go down to the area in whatever city it was, usually near the docks, where the street children were, and just take his sack of coins and just toss it out to them because he didn't need it, didn't want it. So he was not successfully Americanized. I love that story. It says so much, though, about the difference between Native culture.
Oh, there's this good quote, man. I don't know, Valerie, I must have shared it. It was a while back. I wanna say it right now, but I don't even know what it is. I can't remember, but it's so good. I'm gonna have to share it another time.
Okay, can you paraphrase it?
I don't know. It's just the way, oh man, I don't want to mess it up. I think it's so
Okay.
good that I don't want to mess it up.
Okay, we'll be waiting for it.
Thanks.
I'm glad Hai was able to join us after his other meeting. Any comments or questions? Are y'all still mad?
Who's mad?
Last week, yeah.
Yeah, the class format last week was way more infuriating. I feel like this was historical in a way that didn't make me as angry, I guess. I do have a question. Just if tonight I have some free time and I have time to watch one movie, which one do you recommend the most? I heard you mention the one earlier, but then in previous classes you mentioned some other ones. So I haven't seen any of the movies that you've ever talked about.
If you haven't seen any of them and you had to pick just one, I have to say Smoke Signals.
Smoke Signals, okay.
It's not a Western. It's set in, contemporary.
Okay, perfect.
I would add that Trickster, the series, is very interesting to me because it's billed as an indigenous youth trying to pull his family together, but in actuality, it has all these layers on it of colonialism and teenage depression and suicide, native depression and suicide, family life, love, pipelines, murder, missing indigenous women. I mean, it's just like this flow of different things. I'm really enjoying it.
Okay, Trickster. What are you watching it on?
CW.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, I think it's only going to have one season. I think that the context is a lot for somebody who is non-indigenous to try to figure out. But if you're listening to it, you're seeing all the things that they tried to put in it to make it more relevant, because obviously we want relevancy at this point, and it's like things that you go through on a day-to-day, but on the other hand, you're having to fight things in your own communities and across the nation, and other tribes are fighting it. So you can definitely relate, in those three realms.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'll definitely check that out. I got Trickster, and then what you said, Troy? I need
Smoke
to
Signals.
Smoke Signals. Got it.
I can't confine myself to one. There's a movie called Dream Keepers.
Yes.
Have y'all seen that? Yeah, it's great. It's about
good.
this elderly man and grandson traveling to a storytelling competition, and along the way, there's all this family drama. He's sharing with his grandson traditional stories from several different tribes. And so the framing story is good. And then those stories are good. And then one other thing that I'll mention, if we're talking about traditional Westerns, I don't know how traditional it is, but the movie Little Big Man, which on the surface looks like just another white savior thing, which I think Dances with Wolves definitely is. It's Dustin Hoffman. He plays this guy who's adopted as a child by Cheyenne. I don't really think he qualifies as a white savior because he can't save anybody. But Vine Deloria and a lot of other Native people at the time praised the movie for its accuracy about Native culture. There's a lot of things that were just common in Native culture, like gender issues, the Heyoka, sacred clowns among the Cheyenne, and a lot of other stuff that I've never seen in any other Hollywood-made movie that are
Okay.
There's
I don't know
you
how
had
you
mentioned
guys
in
feel.
class before. Okay.
There's a lot of new representation coming about with indigenous filmmakers. And
Yes.
I want to say that Halloween, there was a special, and it was all scary movies made by indigenous people, and it was excellent. I loved it.
What about A Man Called Horse? You suggest that one?
I've watched that. It makes me a little uncomfortable now because he is such a white savior, right? He's better than all. But so far as some of the cultural representation, that came out the exact same year as Little Big Man. There is some stuff represented on there that had not been shown on film before, like Sundance morning rituals and stuff like that. And the Native actors were humanized. And there were at least a couple of actual Native American actors in that ensemble. As with Little big man, the guy that played several of the people in that were native actors.
How do you guys feel about the Native American portrayal and the modern reservation issues with Longmire?
What's Longmire?
You guys, Longmire was okay. I show an episode of Longmire in my American Indian law class because it's a series that ran for 6 seasons. It's been off for 2 or 3 years. That's set modern day, and Walt Longmire is the sheriff of this Wyoming county, and part of the county encompasses a Cheyenne reservation. So there are all these jurisdictional issues. We got the Cheyenne chief of police, and you've got him, and he has a lot of interactions. The episode I show is one where a member of the tribal council who had been moving toward changing the blood quantum for membership and basically lowering the quantum and excluding more people, gets murdered. And he's murdered outside the reservation, but his body is moved inside the reservation. And there's just, so many jurisdictional things there. Because I think we talked last time. We did. I remember we did.
Catherine Thunderheart.
Yeah. Wind River. Have you seen Wind River?
Have I seen Wind River?
It's about 2 or 3 years ago. It did. It's about a Native woman has been raped and murdered, and there's nothing anyone can do about it by construction workers, pipeline workers. And so only federal officers can do anything. And so they import this federal officer from like 3 states away who has no experience. That's really good at showing these, and it's a good movie too. Longmire, I like. It becomes a little problematic and sometimes because to simplify, it oversimplifies. Tell a story for broadcast television. And then he is a little too much, I don't know. My wife calls him the magic Indian cowboy, but I do like it. I do like it, and I have used it. And I would recommend giving it a look. See what you think.
Another thing that I feel kind of compelled to mention here, and I know it's something we all know, but a couple times we were talking, different people were talking about how Native Americans in certain areas were treated worse than blacks in certain areas. And, that's all good and valid. But I think the bigger point is, and I think we all know it, but let's just say it, that's the idea that power will stratify people. So that way they can play the poor whites against the immigrants or the natives or the blacks, and play the blacks against the Hispanics and blah, 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 blah. And, the queers versus the whatever, all to the oppression may be layered, and it's good to see where those layers are, but it's also to remember that that's all part of the plan of power to oppress in ways that you can manipulate the oppressed.
In fact, there is a letter from the colonial governor of South Carolina from around 1700. Somewhere around there. I don't remember the exact year, but it's in that era, in which he laid out in his report back to the royal government that, boy, we're going to be in trouble when these Indians and slaves start working together. So we need to sow fear between them of each other.
I was really intrigued by what Bailey was saying earlier about the mindset of her people that were kind of sympathetic to white people's views about their politics. I've just this past week been reading some Frantz Fanon, a French Marxist from Martinique. If you hadn't heard of him, he's pretty famous in the Marxist circles. But I just got through reading his part about, and he's writing about decolonization in this instance that I'm reading. and he talks specifically about how colonizers use the colonized people against each other to, like y'all are saying, to sow distrust and disharmony to weaken everybody's ability to resist the colonizers. And what Bailey said is like kind of made the hair on the back of my head stand up, because it sounded so much like what I was just reading from his writings about the colonization of the Black people in Algeria and the French Empire. And I really hope that we're going to hear more from Valerie and Bailey. I love what Troy's been doing with this set of classes and the one we took before. But I've also really enjoyed hearing what Valerie and Bailey had to say. I hope they can come back.
Thank you.
Thank y'all very much. Yeah.
Thank y'all.
Yeah. And then Fadone also wrote about how part of it is to get the colonized people to develop a sense of self-hatred for their culture, you know, to identify with the colonizing culture rather than with their own.
And then you look at, you know, with the past election and everything that's going on and what's going on now, you know, it's just ways to divide us even more in between, you know, if you're Republican or Democrat and liberal and things like that. But, you know, it's just ways to manipulate us even more to become against each other.
It's an age-old tactic. That the first step is you have to be aware of it. Most people are in it and don't see it. All right, well, I'm just going to sit here and stare at you all judgmentally until there's no more questions.
This is a school in Alabama or a university, or what exactly is it? Because it's my first time visiting.
Who wants to answer?
Troy.
Well, I kind of gave my halting answer at the beginning. I was like, man, I wish I was here. So now Hi's here.
I was like, Bailey, get on this call. And she's like, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm so glad you did.
Okay. The North Alabama School for Organizing, we've been going for about a year and a half or so. It's not a chartered school. It's actually a school that belongs to everyone. And the reason that we started the school was it's sort of a continuation of the Rainbow Coalition that started years ago, you know, with the Black Panthers and Young Lords and Young Patriots in Chicago. And we were talking about educate to organize. And we were talking about every culture and color being involved that we can learn from. And also, we were getting tired of seeing so many organizations and organizers, you know, rising up and then fizzling out. Just, you know, where did everybody go? Why? So we started thinking about it and wanted to do a school where we could bring people in and talk about those problems at the same time, educate and organize for progressive change, and to bring, you know, people in to do that, to organize intersectionally, and just allow a school where people could get organized and talk about organizing and learn about the different roles of organizing and learn about different cultures and different peoples, and therefore when they go out in the community to organize, they'll be a little bit more prepared, you know, because there's really not, it's really hard to be an organizer or be in an organizer's role that you don't fit in, but you think you do. But we did run a course in that, and some of the people in the course figured out that, well, this is not the role that I belong in. There's other roles that I belong in, and I just got out of a meeting with what's called Women of Color that I was talking to tonight about the school. And they feel the same way, that there are people in different organizing roles that they really don't fit in. And so, some of those roles could be a foot soldier, it could be a recruiter, a group builder, fundraiser, educator, communicator, statistician, tactician, there's all kinds of different roles. And when we taught a class in that, I think at the end of the class, the people found out that some people said they could fit into different roles. They were in the wrong role, or they could do a multiple of roles. And so that was very important for them to find out. Reggie, if he could speak to that, or Tom, they were in that first class. And now we do this class. Troy has done another class in Native American history. We've had, I believe it's about seven steps of nonviolent protest by Martin Luther King. We do all kinds of fireside chats, bring people in and talk from different organizations. And so what we want to do is move more into the community, to be more involved in organizations, and to bring in different cultures, to share and to build up, and to try to form some type of coalitions, and to show how to do that. So maybe a ramble, but that's some of the ideas that we've had here, because you become dangerous when you educate, and when people know what they're doing, that's the system has a hard time destroying you then, but they'll try. So and like me, when I can say about Chicago, I went to Chicago and I was reading on the third grade level. I got an education, got a college education, and I told some of the people in the authority in Chicago, a few years ago, that I'm the most dangerous guy that you ever want to see, because I'm a hillbilly with a college degree, and so you better watch out.
Earlier I mentioned, it may have been before you got here, Bailey, I mentioned the Highlander Folk School. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but back in the 1930s, it was established by this guy from Tennessee named Miles Horton. And initially it was, kind of toward like preserving Appalachian culture and stuff, but he got involved in a coal mining strike in Fentress County, Tennessee. And the mine owners murdered the guy who was the head of the local coal miners union, just brutally murdered him in cold blood. And after that, Horton restructured his school to make it a school for organizers. And 20 years later, a couple of folks from Montgomery came through some of the classes in that school, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Before they started the bus boycott, which they were planning to start. They went through classes and training to get a better idea of how to organize a community. And I kind of feel like that's the kind of niche that a group like this could fill today.
And that's what we want to do. We would like for it to be like the old Highlander school, where we can bring everybody together, and for workshops, for classes, for celebrations, whatever. And I think that's one of the goals that we have,
There were billboards up.
Yep.
There was a billboard on the way into Memphis on April 4th when Martin Luther King was assassinated. A photograph of him at that school in a class notes. And it said, Martin Luther King at communist school.
And High's going to have an interview next month with the current director of the Highlander Institute.
Awesome.
Wednesday, March 24th.
Fireside chat.
Awesome.
So if anybody's actually interested in a communist school, you got to check out the Automotive Free Clinic. Kai knows who we are. We're disguising ourselves as a mutual aid group, but we are most definitely a communist school.
Fix
It
your
was
car
nice to meet
too.
you all. I've got to go.
Thank you very
Thank
much. for
you.
I'll
joining
try to
us,
catch
Sarah.
up with you next week.
All right.
Take
Look
care.
forward to seeing you again.
Thank
Okay.
y'all for
Bye.
having me too.
Thank you, baby.
Thanks, y'all.
Y'all later.